The screaming started at 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I heard it clear across my property as I was filling my bird feeders. The first Range Rover had just discovered that what used to be a pristine driveway was now a bubbling pit of swamp water and decomposing organic matter. By 7:15, 3 landscaping trucks had sunk up to their bumpers in the muck, and someone was standing on their roof, shouting into their phone that they needed the fire department to bring boats. I stood on my back deck with my coffee, watching the chaos unfold at the edge of Riverside Heights. The HOA president, a woman named Patricia Garrison, was kneed in brown water that had mysteriously appeared overnight in front of her 4,000 square FT Colonial. She was screaming at her husband to call someone, anyone, who could explain why their entire street had transformed into a wetland. That someone would be me. Well, technically, it would be me and the fundamental laws of hydrology. My name is Robert Lawson, and I'm a 48-year-old environmental engineer who made the mistake of buying property adjacent to Riverside Heights 5 years ago. I chose this particular 8-acre plot specifically because of the natural creek that ran through it. The water was pristine, fed by underground springs, and home to native trout and freshwater mussels. I spent my weekends maintaining the riparian buffer, removing invasive species, and monitoring water quality. It was my own private nature preserve, and I loved every square foot of it. Enter Patricia Garrison, self-appointed guardian of property, values and destroyer of anything she deemed unsightly. She ran the Riverside Heights, HOA, like her personal kingdom. She once fined a family $500 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. She measured grass height with a ruler. She had a 3-ring binder dedicated solely to documenting Christmas decoration violations. The trouble started 6 months ago when Patricia decided my creek was an eyesore. She called it a drainage ditch. At first, even though it had been documented on county maps since 1892. She claimed the sound of running water was noise pollution. She said the wildlife it attracted was bringing down property values. She even tried to argue that the creek was a health hazard because she saw a deer drinking from it one morning. I ignored her complaints at first. The creek was entirely on my property, well outside HOA jurisdiction, but Patricia wasn't used to being ignored. She started calling the county, the state, even the Army Corps of Engineers. When none of them would take action against a perfectly legal waterway on private property, she decided to take matters into her own hands. The concrete trucks arrived on a Thursday while I was at work. Patricia had convinced the HOA board that the creek posed a flood risk to their properties, even though it had never flooded in recorded history. Using emergency HOA funds, she hired a contractor to fill my creek with concrete, not divert it, not build proper channels, just dump 40 tons of quick-setting concrete directly into the stream bed. When I got home that evening, I found my beautiful creek transformed into a gray concrete snake winding through my property. The water was already backing up behind the blockage, forming pools that were killing the vegetation. I could hear the confused chirping of birds that had lost their water source. The rage I felt in that moment was indescribable. I called the police first, but they said it was a civil matter. I called the county environmental office, but they were closed. I called my lawyer, who told me to document everything and not do anything rash. So I spent the night taking photos, shooting video, and writing down every detail while the water continued to back up behind Patricia's concrete dam. What Patricia didn't understand, what she never bothered to research in her zealous crusade against my creek, was that water doesn't just disappear when you block its path. It finds a new one. And when you dump concrete into a spring-fed creek that's been flowing for over a century, you don't stop the water. You just make it angry. The underground springs that fed my creek didn't care about the concrete. They kept pumping water up from the water table, same as they had since before. Humans ever set foot in North Carolina. But now, instead of flowing peacefully through my creek bed, that water was spreading underground, following the path of least resistance through the sandy soil. And guess what direction that path led? Straight toward Riverside Heights. Within 3 days, the first signs appeared. The Petersons noticed their basement was damp. The Gwynns mentioned their sump pump was running constantly. The Jacksons complained about a musty smell in their family room. Patricia dismissed all of it as coincidence, probably caused by the unusually wet spring we'd been having. Except we hadn't been having an unusually wet spring. We'd had below-average rainfall for 3 months. By the end of the first week, the situation had escalated dramatically. The underground water had found every crack in every foundation in the newer section of Riverside Heights. Carpets were soaking through from underneath. Hardwood floors were buckling. Mold was beginning to bloom on drywall. The Andersons woke up to find their finished basement under 3 in of water. I watched all of this unfold from my property where the backed up water had now formed a significant pond. I'd already filed complaints with every agency I could think of. The Department of Environmental Quality was particularly interested when I explained that someone had filled a protected waterway with concrete without permits. The Army Corps of Engineers suddenly became very responsive when they realized wetland habitat had been destroyed. Patricia tried to blame me, of course. She claimed I had sabotaged the drainage system somehow. She accused me of drilling wells to flood her neighborhood out of spite. She even suggested I was pumping water from the city supply onto her streets. The HOA held an emergency meeting where she presented her theories with a PowerPoint presentation that included multiple references to domestic terrorism. The county inspector, who came out the next week, was not amused by any of it. He took one look at the concrete-filled creek, checked his maps, and immediately issued a stop work order for the entire neighborhood. Turns out filling a natural waterway with concrete without permits is extremely illegal, like federal crime level illegal. The fine started at $50,000 and went up from there. The Department of Environmental Quality was even less forgiving. They classified it as willful destruction of protected wetlands. The base fine was $200,000 plus restoration costs, plus daily penalties until the creek was restored. They also referred the case to the state attorney general for criminal prosecution. But the real crisis hit when a geological survey revealed the full scope of the damage. The concrete dam hadn't just redirected the water, it had fundamentally altered the water table for the entire area. The pressure from the backed-up springs was now pushing up through the soil, turning the carefully manicured lawns of Riverside Heights into something resembling the Everglades. The million-dollar homes that Patricia had been so desperate to protect were now essentially worthless. Insurance companies classified it as flood damage from an illegal modification, which meant they wouldn't cover it. The county condemned 6 houses as uninhabitable due to mold and structural damage. Property values didn't just drop, they cratered. The emergency HOA meeting that followed was the stuff of legend. It was held in the community center, which now had visible water damage on the walls. Patricia tried to maintain control, but the residents were out for blood. They'd seen the contractor's invoice paid for with HOA funds without a vote. They'd read the inspector's report stating the HOA president had ordered the illegal modification. They knew exactly who was responsible for destroying their homes. The vote to remove Patricia from the board was unanimous, except for Patricia herself, who wasn't allowed to vote. The vote to pursue legal action against her personally was also unanimous. Someone had done the math, and between the fines, the restoration costs, and the property damage, Patricia was looking at potential liability in the millions. Her husband filed for divorce 2 weeks later. Apparently, she'd used their joint savings to pay the contractor without telling him. Their house was one of the condemned ones, and he'd finally had enough of her crusades. He moved in with his brother in Tennessee and left Patricia to deal with the mess she'd created. The restoration took 6 months and cost the HOA $800,000, which completely drained their reserves and required a special assessment on every household. They had to bring in specialized equipment to break up and remove the concrete without causing more environmental damage. They had to rebuild the creek bed, restore the riparian buffer, and reintroduce native plants and wildlife. Patricia's personal consequences were even more severe. The criminal charges resulted in 500 hours of community service, specifically focused on wetland restoration. The civil lawsuits from her neighbors totaled over $3 million. She had to sell her condemned house at a massive loss just to pay legal fees. Last I heard, she was living in a studio apartment in another state, working as a receptionist at a real estate office. The creek flows freely again now. The trout have returned along with the heron and kingfishers. The Riverside Heights HOA dissolved itself after the debacle, with residents voting overwhelmingly to never again grant that kind of power to any individual. Property values eventually recovered, though several families never returned after the flooding. I still maintain my creek, keeping it healthy and clear. Sometimes on quiet mornings, I see former HOA board members walking along the public easement the county established, watching the water flow peacefully through its natural channel. They wave now and sometimes stop to chat about the weather or the wildlife. We don't talk about Patricia or the concrete or the months of chaos that followed. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 2 years probation and fined $750,000 by the federal court for violation of the Clean Water Act. When the judge read the sentence, she collapsed in her chair and had to be helped from the courtroom by bailiffs.